I want to go back to what in our area was March, the week of March 17th. I don't know what week it was where you are, but it was right around then. And everything changed. And so do you know what hemisphere this picture was taken in? Anybody?
I don't.
You don't? Well, it's a black swan, and black swans were impossible until people started traveling to Australia and New Zealand, where swans are actually black. And up until that time, it was considered anything that was a black swan was an impossibility. And the entire impossibility became common actually when people started traveling to the Southern Hemisphere. So at that week, there was oops, that's not what I meant to do. There was a call to action. And we had to do something fast because we had to enable work from home or school from home by, typically the end of the week. You had to get equipment, software, tools, licenses, internet access, training, support, security team, you name it, all of that stuff for everybody, not just, a few. Maybe you had 3 days, okay, maybe you had a week, but that was probably not much more than that. And you had to make it happen. You did not get to say, oh, that's impossible, because it had to happen. And because it had to happen, we figured out how to make it happen. In fact, around the globe, things that everybody would have thought were impossible actually happened. So I had a granddaughter who was stuck in Morocco, and I was on the internet for about, a half a day trying to figure out how to get her home. We did fine, but many of her colleagues that were there in Morocco got stuck for weeks. Professors and kindergarten teachers, didn't matter where you were in the teaching spectrum. My daughter teaches middle school, 12-year-olds. They had to figure out how to teach online, and they had like 3 days. And the tech support for that had to happen too. And the stores that did remain open found that people didn't want to go into them. And so they had to figure out how to offer whatever it is that they were selling without contact. In our area, we call it curbside pickup, where you order online, you pay online, you drive to the store, you call inside, and somebody brings your order out to the car and puts it in, and that's fine. It took almost a month for most of the stores around here to be able to do that. But inside of 6 weeks, every single retail outlet in my neighborhood could do curbside pickup or delivery. Zoom became a verb. I didn't actually know about Zoom ahead of that. I'd heard of it, but I never used it. And when this stuff happened, for instance, a store has to offer contactless pickup or curbside pickup. Some ad hoc team got formed, and it wasn't a software team. It was a team of people that had to figure out where do we stage the groceries? How do we keep our internet, our online inventory correct? How do we make sure that if we don't have something, what are we going to do about it? How do we stage the driving up? How do we contact the people inside? Where do we put the bags of stuff once they've been collected? How do we have enough people to do the shopping? All of those things. And by the way, there had to be some technology. Actually, technology it was not necessarily a driver, but it was fundamental to many of these problems. So software engineers joined teachers or store workers or procurement experts or call center staff, you name it. And they took one problem after another, and they figured out how to fix it so that people could work from home, or people could do contactless pickup or whatever. And everybody on that team knew what success looked like. Nobody had to tell them. When the customers were happily doing whatever they were trying to make possible, that was success. And speed was really essential. The faster you could get your grocery store back on with contactless pickup, the more you were going to be able to keep your store available. And failure wasn't an option. There was no, we can't do this. It had to happen. And if you look at it, a whole bunch of companies went through a digital transformation. If you think about a digital transformation, it's moving everything that you've got to a digital world. And some places did it in less than a week. But the thing that we learned when we were handling all these emergencies was This was not about software. This was about something else. It was about providing technology infrastructure to accomplish something, whether it's schooling at home or shopping online or whatever, something that was urgent, something that was really important and much bigger than software. So the teams we joined were not software teams. The teams we joined were teams to solve that problem. And we learned a lot about each other when we started working from home. We learned that our coworkers are real people. They had children, they had dogs. If you looked in the background, you could see a guitar or a bike hanging from the wall. Oh, we got Tom's pictures back here. We learned empathy for people that we might have thought of as just somebody that we met at the office before that. And we learned about management. So supervisors could no longer closely monitor the activity of people. So responsibility had to replace close supervision, or it didn't. There was a rise in workforce optimization software where the supervisors could monitor when people went online, exactly how much time they spent and exactly which pages of which apps. Not for sure everybody did that, but a few people thought we are going to sell this as an efficiency generator. So in response to that, I would like to recommend Barry O'Reilly's blog, which is Why Your Company Isn't Profiting from Remote Productivity. And he basically says, in a distributed world, we have to think differently about management, about what's important and what isn't important. And we need to create a strong connection between work effort and customer satisfaction. We need to have the people that are doing work see the results of what they're doing with customers. That's how these ad hoc teams knew they were doing well. They could see that the customers were able to do what they were supposed to be able to do. So if you think about, has working from home been successful? It depends on how you define success. If you define success as productivity, at first, yes, for the labor put in, there was more output because it was novel and because it was different. But later, productivity fell. And this is not everywhere, but pretty common. However, if you do what Barry O'Reilly suggested and define success as delighted customers, which, you know, productivity is a proxy for delighted customers. If you actually go to the end result you're trying to get and define success as delighted customers, teams that had responsibility for making the customers happy, for customer satisfaction, yes, absolutely. They were connected with their customers and they never lost sight of it, and productivity or success happened. And on the other hand, if you look at teams that had proxies, you know, like productivity metrics or intermediaries telling the teams what to do, or lots of kinds of proxies can get in between a team and the customer they're working for. Well, I don't know. That's something that was much harder to determine whether or not it was successful. So Barry says in his blog, the leaders who manage by outcomes rather than controlling outputs, those leaders didn't have a whole lot of trouble shifting to remote work because their natural focus was saying, these are the important problems. Here's how we're going to know that's successful. And when they started seeing whatever outcomes that seemed to solve the problems, that's what they supported. They weren't telling the teams what to do. They were telling the teams what their target was, what it meant for what was important, and what it meant to have happy customers. So I like to talk about this term called respect. And in my book, respect for workers, people who are doing work, means that they solve critical problems without proxies between them and their customers. And there's lots of kinds of proxies. There's two kinds that I think about all the time. One is proxy metrics, okay? I'm trying to drive a metric rather than have customers happy. And the other is proxy intermediaries that bring to a team the priorities of what they're supposed to work on or something like that. And I would like to see respect for our teams, meaning that they're given problems and proxies are not telling them how to solve the problem. Now shift gear to supply chain things that also kind of collapsed at the same time that back there. And well, it maybe took a few weeks, but there were dramatic shifts in demand that couldn't be accommodated. For example, personal protective equipment. There just was not enough of it. Cleaning supplies like hand sanitizer and you name it, and food. So in our country, flour, you couldn't buy flour. Why couldn't you buy flour? Well, flour is packaged half for consumers in 5-pound bags and half for bakeries in 50-pound bags. There was plenty of grain. There was plenty of demand. There were plenty of spots in the supply chain, but there wasn't enough packaging to package stuff in 5-pound bags, and people didn't want to buy 50-pound bags. And therefore, we had a strong shortage of yeast, flour, all sorts of baking supplies for quite a while, 6-8 months, or 8 weeks. But infrastructure, we could have worried about that if we would have lost it, but we had no problem with water, no problem with electricity. We already had a strong internet, and it only got better and actually, interestingly enough, less expensive. It was much more resilient than the supply chains. And you might ask yourself, why is that? Why do supply chains break under extreme stress, but actually infrastructure generally does not? Well, first of 2 reasons. When the demand changes faster than the time something is in the supply chain, then the supply chain is going to break. And secondly, when the demand exceeds the capacity at some link in the supply chain, then it's going to break. The first one, demand changes faster than supply chain. If you think about personal protective equipment, the demand went really far, but the supply chain meant make it in Asia, put it in a container, get the container on a container ship, go across the ocean, get the container ship docked, get onto the land, and get the container put onto a truck and then drive to the middle of Illinois or something like that. And that's a long supply chain, and the demand changed way faster than that supply chain. Or if you think about the flour, there was only one link in the supply chain, the packaging capacity and the packaging materials. And that link broke the whole supply chain. So those are the 2 ones. Now, if you go back to demand changing faster than time in supply chain, where you find that most important is with durable goods like appliances and things like that. Those tend to be very slow, unresponsive supply chains. My son wants a new oven for Christmas. You know what? We just can't buy appliances right now. They're just not around. Perishable goods, they're basically much faster and more responsive, and I'm going to talk about that in another slide, so I'll just pass that up. And infrastructure, interestingly enough, it's not designed for current demand. It's almost always designed for a long-term vision. Like if you're putting in a new park, you plant trees, and it's going to be 20 years before those trees are big and shady and all of that, but that's okay. We're designing infrastructure for the future, not for right now. So we don't have anything like the same response to the current demand. If you look at when demand exceeds capacity at some link in the supply chain, well, resilient supply chains have to have slack at every step. You have to have a way to package small stuff as well as large stuff. It was interesting, there's plenty of flour in silos, and there was actually plenty of milling capacity. And the reason was because as old, like even very ancient mills had been repurposed, maybe even turned into museums, they starting them up again. There were a lot of mills around that could be restarted, but there wasn't the packaging. The other thing that happens in a supply chain is not having really tight coupling between different pieces of a whole supply chain. Because if you can get around a bad spot, like the packaging, and do some different kind of packaging, then loose coupling will limit the blast radius of failures. That's why you want to have loose coupling, because when things change fast, you don't want that to spread through the whole supply chain. If there had been just there was actually a way to take flour packages and put them in different kinds of packages. And it was interesting that some of our best flour companies quickly switched to a different way of packaging flour and were able to get going again. Infrastructure is designed for aggregated maximum demand. at any point. And so it does not have a problem with demand exceeding capacity. And that's why our infrastructure was much more solid. Now, I promised to talk about perishable goods supply chains, and I would like to propose that we think about them as being optimized for speed, okay? For rapid movement of a vegetable or dairy product or meat from where it's available, like the vegetables are just ready to harvest, until it's on my table and I can eat it. And you want to make that as fast as possible because I want my vegetables to be as fresh as possible. Or fruit. Here in Minnesota, we get most of our berries and stuff like that from South America. They're in a alternate season as us. In the summertime, we get stuff from California, and in the wintertime, we get stuff from, say, Chile. And it's a very fast supply chain. Now, if you take a look at this woman is bringing produce to market, and it's not the most efficient way to get that stuff to market. In fact, perishable supply chains never optimize for resource efficiency. They don't say, let's put a truck by the fields, and when the truck is filled up, let's drive it to the market. Because the truck would fill up and the fruit would spoil, or the vegetables would spoil before you ever got to trying to sell it. They don't optimize for utilization. Doesn't make any sense in a perishable goods supply chain to optimize for resource efficiency or for resource utilization. They never accumulate large batches because stuff spoils, because smaller batches move faster. And when there's a great big batch, it's just going to go bad. In a perishable goods supply chain, they aggressively discover and eliminate the biggest bottleneck. So, for example, take our raspberries coming from Chile. How do you not have them wait in a container at the airport for a half a day? That's a bottleneck. So you have to go faster than that. You use the consumption, what people are buying, to pull replenishment. So when I buy strawberries or raspberries and they happen to come from South America, that's going to cause all the way back down to Chile, somebody to figure out how to get some more strawberries picked. And you leverage customer feedback to make product supply decisions. So when this woman sells her, let's say she sells the oranges fastest, she's going to bring more oranges the next time. So the lesson here in any time you want to be resilient is, and this is a classic lean mantra, don't batch and queue. You say, okay, what does that mean to me? Well, projects are batches. Backlogs are batches. Prioritization is operation on a big batch of stuff. Estimates are tools to use on big batches of work. Every one of these things is a tool for a push system, and they forecast demand. And in times of uncertainty, push systems are absolutely not going to be right. They will be wrong because they're taking what used to be true and pushing it forward as what we should be doing next. The thing you want to do instead of all of these things, which you maybe thought were good, is you want to pull from demand. So what does pull from demand mean? Or how do you do it? What you need to think about is, how do I establish a very regular cadence of delivery of work? And then how do I know my rate of delivery? How do I know how many items I deliver to production every week or every month? And for example, I was talking with a woman who was interviewing us, and she is a writer. She wrote blog articles, and she was about to interview Woody Zoll. And she said that, I said, the no estimates guy. And she says, yeah, what's an estimate anyway? And I'm thinking, okay, so she's a writer. She doesn't know what an estimate is. So, and why do some people think they're good and some people think they're bad? And I said, well, let me ask you a question. You're a writer. How many articles do you write in a month? And she said, oh, I write 8 articles a month. That's like two a week. I said, would you ever accept 12 articles in a month? And she said, no, of course not. And I didn't ask her, but I'm betting she's not accepting very far ahead in advance either, because once she accepts it, she knows how to deliver. That's the concept. Know the rate at which you can deliver stuff and don't accept demand at a higher rate. If you can deliver 8 a month, then don't accept 10 a month. Don't do it. And maintain a very short buffer of work to absorb variation in demand. So maybe she schedules her articles like for a month out, but not for 3 months out, because that doesn't make sense. That's too far in advance. So think about that. I will talk one more time about it later on in the talk. But now I want to come to the next thing, and that is, after we had our supply chains collapse, we had a recession and things got disrupted. Now, we in the software industry, we know a lot, in the electronics and the digital industry, we know a lot about disruption because we've been living with disruption for decades. So this is a picture, this is on our first book. This is a picture in Sardinia where Tom and I are on a bike trip. And because it's a bike trip, we can't carry a lot of stuff, and Tom is a photographer. So he bought his very first digital camera, a 3-megapixel camera, for that trip, and he took this picture with it. And the date on the picture is May 25th, 2002. And I'm going to tell a little bit about Kodak versus Fujifilm. At the time, Kodak and Fujifilm were the big film companies. And here is a curve of the demand for color film. From March 1994 until March 2003, okay, 1 year after this picture was taken, and Tom switched to digital, he never switched back to film, was the peak demand for digital, for film. And then it just dropped off. And by 2012, it was gone. Now, Kodak and Fujifilm took this problem and solved it in absolutely different ways. Kodak tried other ways to deal with imaging and had a really hard time backing off from their imaging business. Fujifilm took a look at its access, and it just sort of, it didn't back out of business as it was still in, but it didn't put any more money in it either. It tried to invest all of its money in alternate uses for its assets, and it got into the cosmetics business and and the pharmaceutical business and other kinds of chemical businesses that were actually technically not dissimilar to the film business. In 2010, Kodak's revenue had dropped 48% from 2000, and Fujifilm's revenue was up almost 60%. So there's a massive difference in the success of their response. And in 2012, Kodak declared bankruptcy. So I'm going to do one more disruption, and this is Netflix versus Blockbuster. Now, you may or may not know about Blockbuster, because Blockbuster was a, Netflix, I'm sure, but Blockbuster in 2004 was a $6 billion revenue company that had storefronts where you walked up and rented videos. And then so they basically had 3,000 storefronts in the US alone. And they had things like late fees, which annoyed all their customers. And then here's where Netflix had a different idea. Since people don't like late fees, let's do DVD by mail. Let's do a flat fee subscription, and they get another DVD if they return the first one. So they get rewarded that way instead of having not to have to pay a fee. So then Blockbuster said, oh boy, they're making some headway, so we better say no late fees. And then maybe they also started DVD by mail, but then you returned it to the store. And then they discovered that the no late fees was really cutting into their revenue. Oh, and by this time, in about 2007, Netflix started streaming, and they added it to the subscription. You could have, say, 2 hours of streaming a month or something like that. So at that point, Blockbuster reinstituted its late fees because it really wasn't making enough money without it. They changed their CEO, different strategy, more late fees. And then they started downloading movies. You could go to the store kiosk, use their special memory, download a movie, bring it home, and show it on special Blockbuster equipment in your home. You know what? Didn't go over too well, but they thought it was going to solve their problem. And that didn't work so well, and they were losing more money, so they added more late fees. And as you can see, once they did that, their revenue went way down. Meanwhile, Blockbuster went to streaming-only subscriptions at the same time, and the rest is history. By 2013, there was no more Blockbuster. So when you think about disruption, there's a few basic rules that we've learned from decades of having digital disruptions. One is stop doing what isn't working. Okay, like just stop. Stop annoying your customers. Blockbuster was really good at annoying their customers. The fees that Kodak was charging for processing, again, very annoying to customers. Preserve cash. Don't start charging customers more. Figure out how not to spend money on anything that you don't think is going to move you forward. Then look for some sort of unmet need that matches the assets that you have available and leverage that expertise and assets against that unmet need. And then establish short customer-focused feedback loops in order to figure out what to do. I mean, this is the classic playbook for disruption. At 3M, we had a saying that said, try lots of stuff and keep what works. And that's pretty much what you got to do in disruption. In fact, this is not unique. Lots and lots and lots of places in lots and lots and lots of cities figured out how to do that. But this is an example of a pizza maker, the little storefront pizza maker in Chicago that figured out how to use their people and equipment to make face shields rather than pizzas. And same ovens, basically the same. They even use their pizza boxes to stack them up and deliver them. And they switched to thousands of face shields in every week. And they kept their employees employed and their equipment in use and made it back to serving pizzas eventually. So that's one thing about disruption. What you need is maneuverability. You need to be able to move fast. These are Impalas. And it's amazing that Tom got these pictures because they never freeze in a position for more than half a second. And then their heads are up and they're looking around because it's much more important to find out if a lion or a leopard is looking for you for lunch than it is to have a fight with that other male. So they are just the fastest moving, maneuverable little animals I've ever seen. So maneuverability, this is a picture of a 1952 F-86 Sabre. It was the plane that pilots from the US brought into the Korean War, and they engaged Soviet MiG-15s, which were faster, had heavier firepower, narrow turning radius. But you know what? In the end, they were credited with a 10-to-1 ratio of their plane surviving and the MiG-15s not. And so Boyd, who was a pilot, went back home and said, why is it? Because if we could figure out what it is about that plane, it was obviously not the speed, not the firepower, not the narrow turning radius. What is it about that plane that made it so successful? And he, with all of his calculations and simulations, decided that its success was a byproduct of its ability to transition from one maneuver to another maneuver faster than the MiG-15. Maneuverability. They can go from doing one thing to doing another thing. So he came up with this OODA loop, or I'll call it a maneuverability loop. It's very similar to the PDCA, Plan, Do, Check, Act loop of Deming. And its concept is that you observe what's going on. Orientation, we'll talk about in a minute, so I'll just pass it up. You make a decision and action. Now, your observations are fed into your thinking or orientation process. And then coming out of that is a decision, but it's a hypothesis. It's what I'm going to try next. Not what I'm going to do, but what I'm going to try. And the action you take is a test of whether or not your hypothesis is correct. And it's that loop that you constantly do, and as fast as you can do it, has something to do with your ability to survive. So let's look at the orientation loop. What's going into your thinking is, yes, new information, but also genetic heritage, cultural position, previous experiences, and what's going on right now. And you analyze and synthesize. And the objective of all of this is to update your mental model and make sense of the environmental change. So this is really important because it's what I'm going to talk about. That's why I think it's, I'm going to talk about it because I think it's the critical thing of the OODA loop, of the maneuverability loop, is what you want out of orientation is a new mental model about what the world is all about. whenever something changes, you have to say something about the way I used to think has to change. And what I want to do is present to you some mental models that we may hold dear that maybe we should be thinking about updating. Let's start out with the mental model number one, from the Cathedral to the Bazaar. So Eric Raymond wrote The Cathedral and the Bazaar. It was a blog in 90, or it was a presentation to a conference in 97. It was a blog in 99. And he talked about the cathedral. And yes, I know this cathedral doesn't look like this today, but I love Tom's picture anyway. And here's a bazaar. And that bazaar is like lots of little tiny shops with redundant types of fruit. And the shop owner and 5 people manage each one and bring it there. And maybe the people who set up the bazaar tell people the vegetables go here, the fruit goes there, but that's it. And it's up to all those little individuals to figure out what to do. And if you think about the mental model of the cathedral, it's plan the work and work the plan. And if you think about the mental model of the bazaar, it's you build it, it's your own, okay? Now, back in the 90s, the cathedral mental model was the only mental model that you could imagine for software development. The bazaar was the mental model of the open source folks. And the point of Eric Raymond's book was, how could this work? And well, guess what? It does. How can it work that the small bazaar model, small owners doing whatever, how can that possibly lead to a better, more stable system? And when you're thinking about, microservices and all those different kinds of things, think about this. How is it that the bazaar model can be better than the cathedral model? As Eric Raymond's classic statement in this book was, when you got enough eyeballs on a problem, all problems are small. And you could bring an order of magnitude more thinking power to any problem in an open source world than in the cathedral world. And that's why it works so well. Another mental model that I think we actually have, and in fact, one of the questions that I heard, is your team agile, is a little suspect, and I'll show you why. I think we need to move from delivery teams to problem solving teams. That's sort of the theme of the first thing that I told you of what Barry O'Reilly's blog is all about. This is a delivery team where there's some proxy telling a team what to do, and then the team does it, and then they get measured. Now, I am going to propose that if you have a tech team composed of technical folks, and it's agile, it's still a delivery team. Where are you learning what it is that you're supposed to do? Where do you get the information about what does your team know what to do next? If it's a tech team, it's not solving a whole problem. It's not a team that has all sorts of different people that are doing the various parts of your product. It's just the technical piece. And the tech team has to get its information not from customers and what makes them happy, but from some sort of intermediary that knows what customers are going to want. I believe we need to move to problem-solving teams. And you see all those people up there. They're not all tech and ops and testing and all of that. There's maybe a marketing person, or there's maybe there's various types of, on some of our teams, we used to have lawyers that dealt with proprietary issues. We had all kinds of folks on our delivery teams. And incidentally, there's tech, and incidentally, there's product, and incidentally, there's a designer, probably maybe more than incidentally, there's a designer. And when you have problem-solving teams, tech is on the product team. It isn't a tech team. It is a product team that happens to have some tech people on it, in addition to other people that are necessary to make the customer satisfied. And that's the goal, make the customer satisfied. Here's another mental model. It's right along the same lines. And I'm going to show you a video here, and I'm pretty sure it's going to work. And this mental model is about one of the most interesting videos I've seen for a long time. And its basic message is that creators need an immediate connection with what they are creating. It's by Brett Victor, who's a designer, a sort of a designer's designer. He worked at some of the most interesting Apple designs, and subsequently he's worked on designer tools for designers. And it's not a new video, but it's something I think you're going to enjoy. If I'm having trouble, let me know, Andrea. Okay.
I've spent a lot of time over the years making creative tools, using creative tools, thinking about this a lot. And here's something I've come to believe. Creators need an immediate connection to what they're creating. So that's my principle. Creators need an immediate connection to what they create. And what I mean by that is, when you're making something, if you make a change or you make a decision, you need to see the effect of that immediately. There can't be any delay, and there can't be anything hidden. Creators have to be able to see what they're doing. So what I have here is I've got this picture on this side and the code on this side. And this part draws the sky, and this draws the mountains, and this draws the tree. And when I make any change to the code, the picture changes immediately. So the code and the picture are always in sync. There's no compile and run. I just change things in the code, and I see things change in the picture. And now that we have this immediate connection between the code and the picture, we can start thinking about ways of changing the code other than typing. So for example, this number here is the length of the branches. If I want to control that number, I just point my mouse to it, hold down the control key, and I can dial it up and down. So I can see what it looks like for big branches or small branches, and I can kind of converge on what feels right to me artistically. And this works for any number of the code. I just point to it, dial it up and down. And some of these numbers here, I know what they do, but it's still kind of surprising to see them do it. And other ones are just completely surprising. So down here, I've got this for loop where I'm counting to 16. I'm putting 16 little pink blossoms on every branch. And I can turn that down for less blossom or turn it up for more. But look at what I'm doing here. I'm just kind of moving that number up and down around 20 or so. And it has this really interesting shimmering effect. It kind of looks like the wind is blowing through the tree. And the first time I saw this, I immediately started thinking about how I could use this effect for an animation. How would I ever have discovered that if I had to compile and run between every change? So much of art, so much of creation is discovery, and you can't discover anything if you can't see what you're doing. So having this immediate connection allows ideas to surface and develop in ways that would be impossible before. And that is so important to the creative process, to be able to try ideas as you think of them. If there's any delay in that feedback loop between thinking of something and seeing it and building on it, then there's this whole world of ideas which will just never be. These are thoughts that we can't think. And the thing about ideas is that ideas start small. Ideas start out tiny and weak and fragile. In order to develop and mature, ideas need an environment where the creator can nurture them, and kind of take care of them, and feed them, and shape their growth. And to me, that's what this principle of immediate connection is all about.
So, they're thoughts that you can't think, ideas that cannot be developed because they're baby ideas that need to grow, if creators do not have an immediate connection with what it is that they are creating. And I believe that very strongly, that what we do is create solutions to problems. And if we are not involved in seeing our ideas, trying them out, getting them growing, making them better, then that's, if there's something in between us, whether it's a compile and run or a proxy or a metric or somebody saying, well, I don't want that particular thing, I want you to do it this way, or whatever. If you can't get that immediate connection with what you're creating, there's so many ideas that simply can't be thought, so many things that can't be tried, and so much invention that's not going to happen. So I agree with Brett Victor very strongly. Creators need an immediate connection with what they are creating, and we are creators. Let's go to the one I know I'm going to get questions on, so I'll try it right now instead, because I've never not gotten a question on it, and that is the idea that you don't want backlogs. Okay, so we have this concept that backlogs are good. I would like to tell you that before 2000, we didn't have this concept. It's true that there's always more stuff that we want to do than we have capacity to do. But the idea of backlogs is a particularly interesting thing, because I did lots of stuff long before the idea of a backlog was a good idea. In place of backlogs, let's rethink that, okay? We need a new mental model for how we deal with demand. So here is our output capacity. This is how much stuff we can do. If we can think about 8, stories a month, or you probably almost certainly have data that tells you how many units or how many, unit things can you do in a unit time. Your units might be larger things like small projects, or they may hopefully be smaller things like try something with customers. They might be any kind of small delivery into production. But you do things and you can measure it. You've got data around and you know your capacity. You should be able to go and say how many a week or how many months of these things can I do? And this is how many things you have coming into your demand stream. Yep. I'm going to bet that you all have more input flow than output capacity. This is not unique. I've almost never seen an organization doing technology around the world that doesn't have this problem. So the fact is, there is stuff coming at you that simply will not get done. That's just the way it is. And the best way to handle that is to recognize that instead of hide it in the backlog. And so you take your output capacity, you look at your input flow, and you say, you know what, this stuff here, that's just wishful thinking. It's not going to happen. And the faster I can tell people that want stuff done that it's not going to happen, probably the happier they're going to be. And certainly the less junk in the middle of my demand and my output I'm going to have. So instead of a backlog, you have a buffer. This is a buffer. It's got a limited capacity. Let's say that you're sending out 8 things a month and you never want to be more than 6 weeks out on your schedule. So my writer would say I can have 12 things in my backlog and that's it. Beyond that, too bad. But I'm only going to have 11 in case a really important one comes along. So here is your input flow of ideas. And guess what? Your buffer fills up. You commit to writing things or you commit to delivering stuff. And then another one comes. What do you do with it? You don't put it in a backlog. You put it down there in your never list, or you take something out of your list and put it in your never list. But better that you have decided that you're full to capacity and this is a short FIFO, first in, first out queue, and you know that you can't take any more, so you don't. You say, I can't handle that. It's beyond the capacity of my output. That's honest. That's transparent. Okay. And then whatever your rate is of output, it goes out and then you get a little more capacity and you can fill up that capacity. But remember, keep it first in, first out, and make sure that you don't ever accept more than that much stuff. That's what you should do in place of backlogs. Because the backlogs themselves just create friction. They create friction between you and your customers. They create all sorts of excess work by saying, "Oh, I got to estimate. Oh, I've got to figure out which one's the highest priority and the next priority and the next priority." That's just all waste. I'm sorry. You need a short FIFO queue. You need to accept relatively even-sized things, and smaller is better than larger, and make it flow through your system in a predetermined rate so that if your queue is first in, first out, the day you accept to do work, you can tell the person generating the demand when it's going to be done. You can promise date. Another mental model that we need to move to in this world of resiliency, and that is we need to get over iterations. We just need to get over them. You know, in 2000, something that happened in a month was like 3 weeks was like blazingly fast. Today, 2 weeks or even 1 week is really, really slow. It's 2020. This book here on continuous delivery is a decade old. And if that's not your mental model of how you should be delivering things to software, it's time you updated your mental model. So sort of to sum it up, the thing we want to do is solve for resilience. And this book, Sense and Respond, by a couple of designers, Jess Gothelp and Josh Seiden, is all about solving for resilience, sensing and responding rapidly. And what they say is to maintain a continuous two-way conversation with the market. Remember, this is the immediate connection. You want small, multidisciplined teams that have everybody on them that's involved in creating customer delight. It's not a tech team. It's a team that does a service or a product. You want them to have a clear goal. They understand the outcomes that are going to make customers happy, and they understand the constraints. I mean, if this has to be done in a week, it has to be done in a week. That's all there is to it. These teams need to be able to act asynchronously and without permission. Now, the reason why asynchronous is so hard, why teams can't independently deploy into our big systems, is mostly an architecture problem. It's not a process problem. It is an architecture problem. And we got to stop trying to solve architecture problems with process and figure out how to create architectures that allow teams to act asynchronously and without permission, either from their colleagues who might have some dependencies, or without permission from management because they have clear goals, outcomes, and constraints. These teams need to have responsibility for building the right thing, because not building the right thing, building the wrong thing is the biggest waste in almost all software. And the philosophy here is the philosophy of responsibility. The team is responsible. You build it, you own it, it's yours. And by the way, I mean a complete team. I'm not talking about a tech team. I'm talking about a team. And this team delivers to customers frequently with feedback, continuous immediate connection, and they learn their way forward. And success is whether or not the customers are satisfied, not output, not how many things I do, not proxies. So resilience, in conclusion, isn't a luxury, and I propose that you challenge your mental models of how things should be done. It's time, to rethink what we think is important. Beware of efficiency. Efficiency is the thing that really has messed us up in this pandemic, because we haven't thought of redundancy, of loose coupling, of ways to make sure that we have what is necessary when everything changes fast. Beware of proxies. Okay, all that does is slow things down, gums up the work. Look for immediate connection of the team to the results and the customer satisfaction. And beware of backlogs. What you're looking for is a constant, continuous flow of stuff that creates that continuous conversation with the market. So that's what I have, and I would like to say thank you. And I think now it's time for questions.